The air tasted of alkali dust and the metallic sting of rusted iron. It was a dry, hollowed wind that scraped against the town square, carrying the scent of unwashed bodies and stale grease from the saloon. Elara felt the cold bite of the iron shackles cutting into her wrists, the skin beneath worn thin and bruised a deep, mottled purple. The stone platform beneath her bare feet was like a slab of winter ice, freezing the blood in her veins before it could reach her toes. Every breath she drew was a battle against the grit coating her throat. She was a hardscrabble relic of a ruined bloodline. The crowd gathered below the platform did not see a woman. They saw a ledger of unpaid debts left behind by a coward who had fled into the night. They saw her threadbare dress, her hollowed cheeks, and the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. Whispers slithered through the mob, judging the worth of her labor, pricing her life in pennies and spit. The silence in her mind didn't just hang. It pressed against her ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the words before they could reach her lips. Bitterness, dark and absolute, took root in her marrow. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a tremor. Her eyes, the color of scorched earth, stared dead ahead. She was the salt of the earth, trampled under the boots of men who dealt in paper and greed. Let them auction her bones. Let them chain her to a rusted washboard or a barren, unforgiving field. The world had demanded she break, but the crushing weight of their stares only packed the dirt of her resolve harder, turning her spirit to unyielding, silent stone. Then, the glaring sun vanished. A massive shadow eclipsed the light, swallowing the wooden platform in a sudden, terrifying dusk. The low, rhythmic thud of heavy boots struck the planks of the square. It was a slow, deliberate march that silenced the murmuring crowd instantly. Kaelen stepped forward. He did not speak. He didn't have to. The sheer, gravitational pressure of his presence forced the mob to part like wheat before a rusted scythe. He was a towering mountain of scarred leather and quiet violence, his gaze fixed solely on the platform, bringing a heavy stillness to the breathless town. The mayor stood before the wooden auction block, a man of soft hands and tailored wool that mocked the dust-choked reality of the town. Mayor Vance was a creature of ledgers and compound interest, a man who built his empire on the cracked backs of desperate folks. He unrolled a long, crisp parchment, the sound of the thick paper snapping in the dry wind, cutting through the low murmur of the gathered mob. He cleared his throat, a wet, self-important sound that made Elara's stomach turn. "People of this hardscrabble settlement," Vance began, his voice projecting with an oiled theatricality that bounced off the wooden facades of the mercantile and the bank. "We stand here today not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Order must be maintained in this untamed land. Debts must be answered for." The words order and debts hung in the air, but what Elara heard was ruin. The silence in her mind didn't just hang, it pressed against her ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the words before they could reach her lips. He spoke of order, but it was his order, a rigged game where the house always held the deed. Her father's weakness had been the lock, but Vance was the rusted key that had turned it, sealing her fate for a handful of silver. "This woman," Vance continued, gesturing toward Elara with a dismissive flick of his silver-tipped walking stick, "bears the unpayable burden of her blood, a staggering sum squandered on cheap whiskey, hollow promises, and foolish gambles by a man who lacked the spine to face the consequences of his own failure." The crowd shifted, their heavy boots shuffling against the baked earth. A woman near the front, wearing a faded gingham dress and a bonnet stained with sweat, leaned toward her neighbor. "Reckon she'll fetch enough to cover even a fraction?" "Looks half-starved to me," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind, sharp as a rusted blade. Another man, leaning against a hitching post, spat a thick glob of black tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't much meat on those bones. Good for scrubbing floors, maybe pulling weeds in the alkali patches. Nothing a sturdy mule couldn't do better." And the mule don't talk back. The whispers slithered against her skin like cold snakes. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, jagged horizon, refusing to let them see the tremor in her jaw. They looked at her and saw a broken plowshare, a worn, thin rag fit only for the darkest corners of their muddy kitchens. Every syllable they uttered packed the dirt of her resolve harder. She would not weep for them. She would not bleed for their amusement. Vance struck the wooden railing with his cane, a sharp crack that demanded attention. "Silence. The law is absolute. As the guarantor of her father's estate, she is now property of the town trust until the sum of $400 is paid in full. We shall begin the bidding for a 10-year indenture, a decade of labor. 10 years. The number echoed twixt the buildings. A decade chained to the very people who now looked at her like a rabid dog waiting to be put down. "Do I hear $50? Vance called out, his eyes sweeping the crowd with predatory glee. $50 for 10 years of unbroken toil. She is young enough to learn obedience, young enough to have the defiance beaten out of her." The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket of dust choking her lungs. The morning sun beat down on her exposed neck, the heat oppressive and relentless. Vance circled her, a wolf appraising a wounded calf. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of peppermint and stale tobacco. "You should have run when you had the chance, girl," he murmured, his voice too low for the crowd to hear, meant only to twist the knife deeper. "Now, you belong to the dirt." His proximity made her skin crawl, bringing the taste of bile to the back of her throat. The peppermint could not mask the rot beneath his words. Belong to the dirt. She had always belonged to the dirt. She was the salt of the earth, born from it, molded by its harshness. But she would not be buried by him. The bitterness inside her crystallized, sharp and jagged as broken glass. $20. A voice rasped from the back. It was Old Man Miller, the proprietor of the local slaughterhouse, known for working his hands into early graves. $20, Vance announced, unable to hide his smirk. "A pathetic sum for a pathetic legacy, but it is a start. Do I hear 25? The scattered laughter of the crowd was a rusted saw cutting through the morning air. It was a sound devoid of grace, a collective manifestation of their own miserable lives projected onto a convenient scapegoat. They delighted in her ruin. Elara closed her eyes, the metallic taste of blood pooling in her mouth where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. Let them laugh. Let the world break its knuckles against her silence. The scattered laughter of the crowd died abruptly, choked out by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boot heels against the packed dirt. The sound was slow and deliberate, a drumbeat of approaching thunder that cut twixt the jeers and silenced them completely. The crowd parted, pulling back with a collective, jagged intake of breath. Men who had just been spitting tobacco and shouting bids now shrank against the wooden storefronts, pulling their wives by the elbows to clear a wide path. Kaelen emerged from the shadowed edge of the mercantile. He did not rush. His movements were governed by a dangerous, coiled economy. He was a man built from the mountain's own bones, clad in a long, worn-thin duster coat that swept the dust in his wake. Beneath the brim of his weathered hat, his face was a map of old violence, a jagged, pale scar pulled tight across his jawline, twisting slightly when his jaw clenched. He moved with the quiet energy of a predator that had already decided the outcome of the hunt. He reached the base of the platform. The wooden stairs groaned, a high, protesting splinter of sound beneath his massive weight. The sun cast his shadow long and dark across the boards, enveloping Mayor Vance in a sudden chill. Vance's gloating smile dissolved into a tight, bloodless line. The silver-tipped walking stick in the mayor's hand trembled, tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against his own boot. "See here, Kaelen," Vance stammered, his oily voice suddenly stripped of its theatrical resonance. "This is a lawful town proceeding, a matter of established ledgers," and Kaelen stopped inches from the auction block. He did not look at Vance. His dark, impenetrable eyes bypassed the mayor entirely, fixing on the rusted iron shackles binding Elara's wrists. The silence stretched, tight as a drawn bowstring. The rhythm of Kaelen's breathing was slow, visible in the steady rise and fall of his broad chest. He reached into the deep pocket of his duster. The motion was smooth, but Vance flinched backward as if staring down the barrel of a Colt. Kaelen withdrew a heavy, dark leather pouch. He held it suspended over the auction block for a fraction of a second before letting it drop. The impact sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The heavy thud of raw gold coins hitting the hollow wooden block echoed across the breathless square. 400, Kaelen said. His voice was gravel and bedrock, rough and entirely devoid of inflection. Vance stared at the pouch, a bead of sweat cutting a clean track through the alkali dust on his forehead. $400, paid in full. The mayor swallowed hard, his greed battling his instinct to flee. Very well. The indenture is yours. The town transfers the deed of her labor to... No. Kaelen's single syllable severed the mayor's sentence like an axe through a dry branch. Kaelen finally turned his gaze to Vance. The intensity in his eyes was absolute, a cold fire that made the mayor take another stumbling step back. Kaelen's hand rested on the heavy leather pouch. I'm not buying a servant. I'm settling a debt for a person who shouldn't have one. The words struck Elara's chest with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. A person. The town had looked at her and seen a number, a worn-out mule, a vessel for their own bitterness. He looked at her and saw a person. The sudden shift in reality did not bring tears. It brought a violent, agonizing thaw to the frozen river of her pride. The ache in her ribs deepened, a painful expansion, as the suffocating iron weight in her mind began to fracture. Kaelen stepped past the mayor. He took Elara's shackled wrists in his massive, calloused hands. His touch was shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to the rough violence etched into his skin. He produced an iron key, likely coerced from the terrified deputy standing at the edge of the square, and slid it into the rusted lock. With a sharp twist and a heavy click, the chains fell away, clattering dead against the platform. The sudden lightness in her arms sent a rush of fire through her veins, the blood fighting its way back into her numb fingers. Elara swayed, her balance failing for a fraction of a second. Kaelen's massive hand shot out, catching her elbow, steadying her effortlessly. She looked up at him, her chest heaving. I ain't asked for your charity, she forced out, her voice a dry, stuttering rasp. She swallowed the grit in her throat, lifting her chin, her tone hardening into steeled iron. I will work it off. Every last copper cent. I don't owe no man nothing for free. Kaelen studied her face, his expression unchanging, though the scar on his jaw pulled tight. He released her elbow. "Walk," he said. He turned his back on the mayor, the gold, and the platform, stepping down into the dust of the street. Elara stood for a moment, the broken shackles at her feet. She looked at the stunned, open-mouthed faces of the townspeople. Then, lifting the hem of her threadbare dress, she stepped down from the block and followed the giant's broad shoulders. They walked out of the square, out of the shadow of the bank, and toward the jagged horizon. The town remained perfectly, breathlessly silent until long after the dust of their departure had settled. The wagon jolted, a harsh, bone-rattling shudder that sent a spike of pain straight up Elara's spine. The heavy wooden wheels, banded in rusted iron, ground relentlessly against the jagged shale of the mountain trail, crushing the stone into pale powder. Below them, the town of Oakhaven was rapidly shrinking into a meaningless, pathetic cluster of weathered gray boxes, disappearing completely behind a suffocating veil of swirling alkali dust. She sat rigid on the hard wooden buckboard, her knees drawn tight together. Her threadbare gingham dress offered no sanctuary whatsoever against the biting wind that howled down the throat of the canyon. The wind tasted of pine sap and ancient, frozen stone, a sharp, violent departure from the grease, sweat, and defeat that permanently stained the town square. Next to her, Kaelen drove the team of massive, roan draft horses. He was a statue carved from scarred leather and unforgiving muscle. His hands, gripping the thick, braided leather reins, were wide and heavily calloused, the knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white with the sheer physical strain of holding back the massive beasts on the treacherous, steep incline. He did not speak. He had not spoken a single syllable since uttering the word "walk" at the edge of the town boundaries. The rhythm of his breathing was slow, deliberate, a deep, rhythmic expansion of his broad chest that seemed to perfectly sync with the heavy, plodding hooves of the horses. Every time he shifted his considerable weight to counter the pitch of the wagon, the hem of his long, worn-thin duster coat swept over the wooden seat. With every turn of his head, Elara could see the way the pale, jagged scar on his jawline pulled tight and white against the collar of his canvas shirt. "Walk," he had said. Just one word, dropped like an anvil in the dirt. And she had followed him. She had followed him like a beaten stray tracking a butcher, numb to the stares of the people who had just priced her soul for $20. The silence in the wagon didn't just hang. It pressed against her ribs, heavier and more suffocating than the judgment of the entire town. Why did he buy her dead? $400 in raw, heavy gold. A king's ransom squandered on a broken, worn-out woman. She stole a cautious, sideways glance at his profile. It was hardscrabble, cut from the very granite they now traversed. Was this simply a different kind of prison? The iron shackles were gone, left to rust on the auction block, but the ghost of their weight still bruised her wrists. She rubbed the mottled, purple skin, the desperate friction of her thumbs doing absolutely nothing to warm her freezing blood. The bitterness, dark and familiar, threatened to rise again, coating the back of her throat. She was no man's charity case. She would not be a kept pet, and she would absolutely not be a victim. When the time came, she would show this giant the unyielding stone buried beneath her skin. The trail narrowed drastically, twisting sharply upward into the deep. Imposing timberline. The towering ponderosa pines closed in around them like a high-walled fortress, their thick, massive trunks deeply scarred by decades of lightning strikes and brutal winters. The canopy overhead grew incredibly dense, blocking out the pale, weak afternoon sun, casting the wagon into a permanent, somber dusk. Frost patterned the dark, rough bark of the trees, the intricate white crystals spreading slowly like the skeletal fingers of the past, blindly trying to claw its way back into the present. The air here was incredibly heavy with the scent of damp, black earth and rotting wood, a primal, ancient smell that felt entirely removed from the world of ledgers, banks, and men like Mayor Vance. The silence of the wilderness was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the wet snort of the draft horses, the rhythmic, high-pitched creaking of the wagon's axles, and the crunch of shale. It was an isolating, heavy silence, the kind of quiet that forced a person to listen to the frantic, panicked beating of their own heart. It took 3 hours of backbreaking, silent ascent before the trail finally leveled out into a high, hidden valley completely cut off from the lower world. At the far edge of the clearing, backed firmly against a sheer, insurmountable cliff face, sat a cabin. It was a harsh, purely functional structure built of thick, unpeeled logs and sealed roughly with hardened mud and moss. The roof slouched slightly under the heavy memory of 100 brutal snows, and the single front window stared out at the encroaching forest like a hollow, glassless eye. It was not a home. It was a stronghold, a barricade against a world that had clearly been unkind. Kaelen pulled back hard on the thick leather reins. Whoa! The single word was pure gravel and exhaustion. He set the heavy iron brake, the metal lever grinding loudly in the stillness, and stepped down from the wagon in one fluid motion. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't even look back. He merely walked to the rear of the wagon, unlatching the heavy wooden tailgate with a loud clatter. Elara climbed down carefully, her joints stiff and screaming in protest at the sudden movement after hours in the biting cold. Her boots hit the frozen, unyielding dirt with a dull, pathetic thud. She looked around. The isolation was immediate and crushing. The sheer rock walls of the valley boxed them in. There was nowhere to run. If she screamed, the sound would simply die against the pines. "Grab the flour," Kaelen commanded, his broad back already turned to her as he hauled a heavy, iron-banded wooden crate effortlessly onto his right shoulder. His sentences were short, jagged edges of communication, stripped of all pleasantries. Elara moved to the back of the wagon. The canvas sack of flour was 50 pounds of dead, uncooperative weight. She gritted her teeth, grabbing the rough, abrasive canvas with her freezing, bruised hands. It was incredibly heavy, heavier than anything her malnourished frame was used to lifting. But the stubbornness in her marrow flared hot. She absolutely refused to ask for his help. She hoisted it aggressively against her hip, a sharp, blinding pain shooting through her collarbone as her muscles tore in protest. She staggered sideways under the sudden weight, her boots slipping on the frost, but she dug her heels into the dirt, found her fragile footing, and followed his wide, dark back toward the cabin door. He kicked the heavy oak door open with the toe of his boot. It groaned loudly on rusted wire, protesting iron hinges. The inside of the cabin was pitch black, smelling intensely of cold ash, cured leather, and absolute, crushing loneliness. There was a large cast-iron stove dominating the center of the room, a rough-hewn wooden table scarred by the knife marks, and a single, narrow cot tucked away in the far, drafty corner. Kaelen dropped the heavy crate onto the plank floor with a resounding crash that rattled the walls. He turned back to her, his massive, broad-shouldered frame entirely blocking the weak, gray light filtering through the open doorway. "Put it by the stove," he instructed, his voice low in the gloom. She walked past him, her breath catching as she moved. She was acutely, painfully aware of the immense heat radiating from his large body in the freezing, dead air of the room. She reached the iron stove and let the canvas sack drop from her aching arms. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, a small cloud of white dust billowing up instantly in the dim light. Kaelen walked slowly to the narrow cot. He reached down and pulled a thick, worn-thin wool blanket from the lumpy mattress. He turned and tossed it casually onto a stack of cured, stiff deer hides piled near the cold iron stove. "You take the cot, I'll take the floor." Elara stared at the bed, then slowly turned her eyes to him. The sudden, unfamiliar stutter caught hard in her throat. She wrestled with the words, violently biting down on the hesitation until her jaw set into a steeled, unbreakable line. "I ain't taking your bed," she declared, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a flat, hard register. "I'm the one working off a debt. I know my place." Kaelen paused. He was kneeling, holding a handful of dry pine kindling. He looked up at her, his dark, shadowed eyes entirely unreadable in the gloom of the cabin. He didn't argue. He didn't offer a gentle explanation. He didn't sigh. He just turned his attention back to the cold black iron of the stove. "Take the cot," he repeated, his tone flatter than before. He struck a match sharply against the iron grate. The sudden, bright flare of sulfur violently illuminated the deep, harsh lines carved around his eyes and the tight pull of his scar. "Or sleep in the cold. It's your choice." The small flame caught the dry pine needles, a tiny, desperate, flickering light fighting against the overwhelming dark of the cabin. "It's your choice." The 4 words rattled violently inside Elara's skull, bouncing off the walls of her exhaustion. No one had offered her a choice in 10 years. The town had dictated her worth with their whispers. Her father had dictated her ruin with his cowardice. And Mayor Vance had dictated her future with his gavel. This giant, this terrifying, scarred stranger who had bought her life with gold had just casually handed her a tiny sliver of autonomy, and the sheer weight of it felt heavier than the sack of flour she had just carried. She looked at the narrow cot in the corner, then down at the rough, worn thin woolen blanket on the floor, and finally at the massive back of the man kneeling patiently by the growing fire. The dense bitterness in her chest shifted uncomfortably, making room for a confusing, terrifying spark of uncertainty. She wouldn't thank him. She didn't know how to form the words anymore. Her pride wouldn't allow it to pass her lips, but as the small fire finally began to crackle and pop, slowly chasing the bitter frost from the cabin's log walls, the heavy iron weight pressing against her ribs felt just a fraction lighter. Dawn broke over the high valley, not with warmth, but with a pale, bruised light that bled through the dense ponderosa pines like water through a dirty rag. The air inside the cabin was bitter, the fire in the iron stove having died down to a few glowing embers during the long, restless night. Elara lay on the narrow cot, her eyes wide open, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling logs. Her muscles screamed in protest at the slightest movement, a heavy, aching reminder of the wagon ride and the 50-pound sack of flour. She sat up slowly, the woolen blanket slipping from her shoulders. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the steady, deep rhythm of Kaelen's breathing from the floor near the stove. He slept on the pile of deer hides, entirely motionless, a massive shadow wrapped in the worn, thin duster. She stood, her bare feet shrinking from the icy floorboards, and pulled her boots on. She stepped out the back door, the rusted hinges whining softly. The air hit her face like a sheet of cracked glass. Behind the cabin, bordered by a steep, jagged wall of granite, lay a half-acre of cleared land. It was a graveyard of ambition. The dirt was a pale, sickly gray, crusted over with a thick, white layer of alkali salt. It was choked with stunted scrub oak and dry, brittle sagebrush that rattled in the freezing wind. It was dead land, poisoned by its own minerals, hardscrabble and entirely unforgiving. Elara walked to the edge of the plot. She knelt, her knees sinking slightly into the dry dust. She dug her fingers into the earth. It was hard as baked brick beneath the powdery crust. The town of Oakhaven had looked at her and seen this exact patch of dirt, barren, poisoned by the past, incapable of yielding anything of value. Her father had tried to farm land like this once, complaining that the earth was cursed, that a man was a fool to bleed for dirt that wouldn't give back. He had dropped his plow and picked up a whiskey bottle instead. She stood up, brushing the white, chalky dust from her raw hands. The bitterness in her stomach twisted, turning from a cold weight into a slow, burning furnace. She would not be her father. She would not let the mayor's judgment be her epitaph. She turned and walked toward the small, leaning shed attached to the side of the cabin. Inside the shed, amidst piles of rusted traps and broken harnesses, she found a heavy mattock. Its iron head was thick with orange rust, dull and heavy, and the hickory handle was deeply splintered and stained with the dark sweat of whoever had swung it last. She dragged it out into the pale morning light. It weighed nearly 15 pounds, a cruel, heavy implement meant for a man twice her size. Kaelen stepped out of the back door, carrying a steaming tin cup of black coffee. He stopped on the small wooden porch, leaning against the door frame. He watched her drag the heavy iron tool toward the alkali patch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark liquid, the steam rising around the pale scar on his jaw. "Ground's dead," Kaelen said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying effortlessly over the wind. "Alkali burned the life out of it years ago. Ain't nothing gonna grow there." Elara stopped. She didn't turn to face him. She adjusted her grip on the splintered hickory handle, the rough wood biting into her tender palms. The stutter formed in her throat, a momentary hesitation born of 10 years of being told to remain silent before her jaw clamped down, crushing the fear into steeled iron. "Ain't nothing dead that can't be worked," she declared, her voice flat, carrying a jagged edge that surprised even her. The words left her lips, and the echo of them rattled violently inside her own skull. She waited for him to laugh, for him to step forward and snatch the tool from her hands, to tell her she was a foolish, broken woman wasting her energy. That was what the town would have done. That was what her father would have done. She braced her shoulders, preparing for the humiliation, her knuckles turning bone white around the mattock's handle. If he took it from her, she would dig with her bare hands. Kaelen didn't laugh. He didn't move to stop her. He looked at the vast expanse of dead, white earth, then back to her thin, trembling shoulders. He took another slow sip of his coffee. He turned his gaze away, staring off toward the tree line. "Reckon you better start on the south end," he murmured. "Sun hits it first." He went back inside the cabin, leaving the door open just a crack. Elara walked to the south end of the plot. She raised the heavy iron mattock high above her head. her breath hitching as her frail shoulders took the immense weight. She brought it down with everything she had. Clang. The dull iron head struck the baked alkali crust and bounced off violently. The kinetic shock traveled straight up the hickory handle, slamming into her wrists, vibrating up her forearms, and rattling her teeth. A sharp, stinging pain shot through her elbows. The ground hadn't even yielded a fraction of an inch. Only a small, white puff of salt dust rose into the air. She gritted her teeth, tasting the metallic tang of old blood where she had chewed her cheek the day before. She raised the tool again. She brought it down. Clang. And again. Clang. The first hour was pure, blinding agony. The blisters on her palms formed rapidly, swelling with clear fluid before violently tearing open against the abrasive wood, leaving raw, weeping red circles of exposed flesh. Her shoulders burned as if hot coals had been pressed against the joints, but she did not stop. She swung, and she struck, and she ripped the dead earth apart inch by stubborn inch. The rhythm of the labor slowly took over, a brutal, punishing metronome. Raise, strike, pull, breathe, with every swing. She pictured Mayor Vance's oiled, mocking smile. She brought the iron down and shattered it. With every pull of the heavy earth, she felt the heavy iron shackles falling from her wrists. By midday, the sun was a harsh, blinding white disk in the cloudless sky. The temperature had risen sharply, turning the enclosed valley into a dry oven. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, cutting clean tracks through the thick layer of white dust that coated her skin. She smelled the earth as it finally began to turn over. Beneath the dead alkali crust, the dirt was dark and incredibly dry, smelling of ancient stone and deep, buried minerals. The scent triggered a sudden, vivid memory, hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She was 8 years old again, standing in a lush field before the ruin came. Her mother was kneeling in the dirt, rubbing a handful of dark loam twixt her fingers. The soil speaks. Elara. Her mother's voice whispered in her mind, soft and grounding. It tells you what it needs. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. Never force the earth. Heal it. The memory of her mother's warm hand, covering her own small fingers, brought a sudden, violent ache to her chest, a phantom warmth that contrasted sharply with the bleeding, cracked flesh of her current reality. The soil didn't just need breaking, it needed curing. It was entirely too acidic, choked by the salt. She dropped the mattock, her arms trembling so violently she could barely unclench her fingers. She walked mechanically toward the large, stone fire pit Kaelen used outside for smoking meat. It was filled with deep, gray mounds of old wood ash. For the next 3 days, she did not touch the mattock. She found 2 heavy wooden buckets near the shed. She filled them to the brim with the powdery white ash, hauled them to the half-acre plot, and dumped them over the broken dirt. She walked back and forth, hundreds of trips, her boots wearing a deep, permanent trench into the path. The ash coated her clothes, her hair, her eyelashes, turning her into a ghostly, hollowed figure. Then came the water. The stream at the edge of the timberline was fed by high mountain snowmelt. It was freezing, the kind of cold that felt like a knife blade against the skin. She hauled the buckets of water, staggering under the sloshing, brutal weight, and poured it over the ash-covered dirt. The chemical reaction was immediate. The water hit the wood ash and the alkali, creating a crude, weak lye. It hissed faintly, sinking into the soil. She dropped to her knees, plunging her raw, blistered hands directly into the cold mud, mixing the ash and the water deep into the earth. The weak lye burned fiercely against her open wounds, a sharp, chemical fire that made her gasp out loud, but she kneaded the mud. She worked it like she was kneading bread dough, her fingers digging deep, turning the toxic crust into a balanced, dark loam. The mud packed beneath her fingernails, the skin of her knuckles cracking and bleeding freely into the dirt. She was literally pouring her own blood into the foundation of the land. During these days of relentless, agonizing labor, Kaelen existed in a parallel sphere of silent, competent industry. He did not offer to carry a single bucket. He did not tell her to stop when she stumbled and fell to her knees in exhaustion. He sat on the porch, a massive, quiet guardian, repairing heavy leather harnesses with a thick awl and waxed thread. The only sounds in the valley were the heavy splash of water, the squelch of mud, and the rhythmic, precise punch, pull, tighten of Kaelen sewing leather. He watched her. She felt his dark eyes tracking her movements, but there was no pity in his gaze. Pity was what the town offered before they sold you. Kaelen's silence was something else entirely. It was a profound, grounding space. He was giving her the room to fight her own war. Every time she hauled a bucket past the porch, her back screaming, her legs shaking, he would simply shift his weight, lay a piece of repaired leather aside, and pick up the next. His steady, unbroken rhythm became the metronome she used to force her own feet forward. He was sharpening a massive hunting knife on a whetstone, the shk of the steel against the stone matching the ragged pull of her breath. He moved with extreme, deliberate economy, his large hands managing the delicate edge of the blade, the pale scar on his face catching the afternoon light. He was the anchor, heavy and immovable, allowing her to weather her own storm. It took 2 full weeks to break and cure the half-acre. By the end of it, Elara was physically unrecognizable. The threadbare gingham dress was ruined, stiff with dried mud, ash, and blood. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp, but her eyes, the color of scorched earth, were no longer dead. They held a fierce, terrifying light. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, but the frailty was gone. The muscles in her forearms and shoulders were corded, hardened like cured leather. She had stripped away the victim the town had created and forged a weapon in its place. On the 15th evening, she found a heavy canvas sack in the back of the root cellar. She untied the thick twine. Inside, pale and hard, lay 50 pounds of winter wheat seed. It was old, likely left behind by whoever had abandoned the cabin years ago. But it was dry. The next morning, the sewing began. It was a delicate, rhythmic process that required a totally different kind of endurance. She tied a makeshift apron from a piece of torn canvas, filling the deep pocket with the hard seeds. She walked down the long, straight furrows she had painstakingly dug into the cured, dark earth. She reached into the apron. Her cracked, calloused fingers closed around a handful of the grain. With a sweeping, fluid motion of her arm, she cast the seeds onto the dirt. Step. Reach. Cast. The seeds hit the soft earth with a sound like light rain. She moved down the line, a solitary figure in the vast, shadowed canyon, performing an ancient, sacred arithmetic. 1 seed for the earth, 1 for the sky, 1 for the harvest. The sun beat down on her back, but she didn't feel the heat. She felt the incredible, undeniable weight of creation. The mayor had tried to bury her, to turn her into dirt, but she had taken the dirt, broken it, poisoned it with lye, and forced it to yield. She was no longer just surviving the silence. She was commanding it. After casting, she used a wooden rake to gently pull the dark soil over the seeds, burying them in the bed she had bled to build. When the final row was covered, she stood at the edge of the field, leaning heavily on the handle of the rake. The sun was dipping below the canyon wall, casting long, purple shadows across the perfectly straight, dark lines of the earth. Her hands throbbed, her back ached with a dull, constant fire, but her chest felt incredibly light. The suffocating iron weight was gone. Now, the hardest part began, the waiting. For 7 days, she hauled water from the stream, carefully showering the dark earth, praying the old seeds still held the spark of life. Kaelen went hunting, disappearing into the timberline for days at a time, returning with heavy cuts of venison that he silently hung in the smokehouse. They existed around each other, two solitary planets caught in the same gravitational pull, speaking only when absolutely necessary, communicating entirely through the shared religion of hard labor. On the morning of the 8th day, a heavy, gray mist clung to the floor of the valley. Elara walked out to the field with her wooden bucket, the cold dampness seeping into her bones. She stopped at the first furrow. She dropped the bucket. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, the water splashing over her boots. There, pushing violently through the dark, cured loam, was a single, tiny spear of green. It was fragile, practically glowing against the harsh, gray landscape, a microscopic act of defiance against a hostile world. Elara sank to her knees in the mud. She hovered her scarred, trembling hands over the tiny sprout, terrified that simply touching it might break the spell. She stared at the green shoot, her vision suddenly blurring as the tight, jagged knot in her chest finally, irrevocably snapped. She didn't weep. The tears that fell onto the dark earth were silent, hard-won, and tasted heavily of salt. She had not just grown wheat, she had resurrected her own soul. The night the first wheat sprouted, the canyon wind howled with a renewed, bitter ferocity, violently throwing itself against the thick log walls of the cabin. The frost patterns formed instantly on the single window glass, intricate and jagged, resembling the skeletal fingers of the past, desperately trying to claw their way back into the warmth. Outside, the world was a freezing void of black pine and crushing stone, but inside, the iron stove radiated a fierce, dry heat. The fire crackled sharply, a bright, living thing that cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. The shadows flickered and twisted, looking less like mere absences of light and more like the ghosts of Oakhaven, the mayor, the townspeople, the whispering mob, all reduced to silent, powerless shapes burning away in the glow of the hearth. Elara sat on the edge of the narrow cot. The adrenaline of the morning had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing exhaustion that settled deep into her marrow. She stared down at her hands resting in her lap. They did not look like human hands anymore. They were swollen tight, the skin cracked and violently angry, crusted with dried mud, pale wood ash, and the dark, oxidized brown of her own dried blood. The blisters had popped and reformed so many times that her palms were nothing but raw, weeping flesh. The physical pain was a constant, blinding throb, perfectly matching the erratic beat of her exhausted heart. Across the room, Kaelen sat on a low wooden stool by the roaring stove. He was completely silent, his massive frame hunched over a piece of oiled leather. The heavy hunting knife in his hand moved with terrifying precision, the steel sliding seamlessly through the thick hide. The rhythm of his breathing was slow, deep, and steady. The flickering firelight caught the deep, pale scar on his jaw, highlighting the jagged, brutal history carved into his flesh. He paused. He did not look up immediately, but the absolute stillness in his broad shoulders indicated that he was acutely aware of her trembling. He set the heavy knife down on the plank floor. The steel clinked softly against the wood. He stood, his immense height casting a shadow that swallowed her completely, and walked toward the small washstand in the corner. He poured steaming water from a black iron kettle into a shallow wooden basin. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a small, deeply dented brass tin. He walked over to the cot and knelt on the hard floor right in front of her. He did not ask for permission. He reached out with his massive, calloused hands and gently took her ruined wrists. His fingers were thick as iron spikes, rough and hardened by decades of brutal labor. Yet the way he held her was shockingly delicate, as if he were handling a wounded bird that might shatter under the slightest pressure. He lowered her trembling hands into the steaming water. The heat hit her raw skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Elara hissed violently, her entire body jerking backward, her shoulders slamming against the log wall. "Hold still," Kaelen murmured, his voice a low, grounding rumble that vibrated beneath the howling wind outside. "Hold still." The command was soft, but it carried an undeniable weight. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the primal urge to pull away. For 10 years, the only touch she had known from the hands of men was a violent shove, a cruel snatch of her elbow, or the cold bite of rusted iron shackles. Pain was always the precursor to humiliation. But the water, though stinging fiercely, was clearing away the toxic alkali dust. He wasn't hurting her, he was dismantling the armor of dirt she had built. The realization was terrifying. It was far easier to brace for a blow than it was to accept grace. The sudden vulnerability pressed against her ribs, causing a painful, suffocating tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical agony in her palms. Kaelen used a piece of clean, white linen to carefully wash away the dried blood and ash. He worked in absolute silence, his dark eyes focused entirely on the task. He navigated the torn flesh and open blisters with the meticulous care of a watchmaker. The water in the wooden basin quickly turned a dark, muddy rust color. When her hands were finally clean, he reached for the dented brass tin. He popped the lid off with his thumb. A sharp, intensely earthy aroma instantly filled the small space between them. It smelled of crushed juniper berries, beeswax, bitter roots, and ancient pine sap. He scooped out a thick dollop of the dark green salve with his index finger. "This will bite," he warned quietly. He pressed the salve directly into the deepest crack on her palm. Elara gasped out loud, a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the quiet cabin. The salve burned fiercely, a chemical, herbal fire that felt like liquid sulfur being poured into her open veins. She tried to yank her hands away, her breath coming in panicked, stuttering gasps. Kaelen's grip tightened instantly, not to hurt her, but to anchor her. He held her wrists firmly, preventing her from fleeing the pain. "Let it burn," he said, his voice entirely flat, stripped of all pity. "It's drawing the poison out. The earth took its toll. Now you have to let the root heal the soil. The earth took its toll." Elara stopped fighting him, her shoulders slumping forward in defeat. Her breath hitched violently in her throat. He spoke of the poison in her hands, but the words echoed deep into the hollowed-out cavern of her chest. The town of Oakhaven had been the poison, injecting their bitterness into her veins, drop by agonizing drop until she believed she was nothing but a diseased ledger of debts. She had let their hatred burn inside her for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. The intense, herbal fire of the salve slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, penetrating, and merciful numbness. The physical relief was so profound it made her lightheaded, but the emotional unspooling was far more devastating. Kaelen continued to work the thick, green salve into every broken line of her hands. His gaze never wavered from her skin. They didn't just auction your father's debt. Kaelen spoke suddenly, the gravel in his voice breaking the long silence. He did not look up. They auctioned his failure. They needed a monument to their own righteousness, and your misery was the cheapest stone they could find. Elara stared at the top of his weathered hat. She swallowed hard, forcing her vocal cords to work. Why do you care what they needed? You threw $400 of raw gold into the dirt just to spite them. You don't belong to them. Kaelen stopped rubbing the salve. He slowly lifted his head. The flickering firelight caught the deep, pale scar that ran from his cheekbone down to his collar. I don't belong anywhere, Kaelen said softly. My father was a white prospector. My mother was born to the tribes that used to hunt this canyon before the railroad tore it in half. The town looks at me, and they don't see a man. They see a half-breed error. They see wild blood they can't control, wrapped in a ledger of sins my father committed simply by loving a woman they considered an animal. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing a small, circular scar on the back of his own massive hand. 10 years ago, Kaelen continued, his voice dropping to a somber, hollowed whisper. I tried to buy a plot of land near the river. Fair money, honest gold. Mayor Vance and 6 of his deputies cornered me behind the mercantile. They said my kind didn't hold deeds in Oakhaven. They took my gold, and they took turns showing me the boundaries of their law with iron pipes and rusted chains. He pointed to the jagged white line on his jaw. This wasn't a bear, Elara. This was civilization. This was civilization. The words hit her with the crushing weight of a collapsing mine shaft. She looked at the terrifying giant kneeling before her, the man who had bought her life, and finally saw the boy who had been beaten into the dirt simply for existing. They were exactly the same. They were both outcasts, discarded relics of ruined bloodlines, punished for the perceived sins of their fathers. The town had shattered them both, leaving them to bleed out in the alkali dust. The realization completely shattered the last remaining wall of her stubborn pride. The man holding her hands wasn't a captor. He was a fellow survivor who had recognized the exact shape of her wounds because he carried them himself. You didn't buy me to save me, Elara whispered, the stutter finally gone, her voice ringing with a steeled, absolute clarity. You bought me because you knew exactly what it felt like to have the dirt packed tight over your chest while you're still breathing. Kaelen looked directly into her eyes. The dark, impenetrable shields he always wore were entirely gone, leaving behind a raw, echoing vulnerability. He slowly reached up and picked up a roll of clean, white bandages. I bought you, he corrected her, his voice barely audible over the roaring fire, because a woman who can survive the silence of that town without breaking is a woman who can make dead earth yield wheat. I didn't save you, Elara. I just handed you the mattock. He began to wrap her hands, the rough linen pulling tight, securing the healing salve against her broken flesh. The binding was firm, supportive, holding her fractured pieces together. If you are sitting in the quiet of your own dark room right now, listening to the wind rattle your own windows, ask yourself the hard truth. We all carry the rusted iron of past debts. We all have places where the earth feels dead and choked by alkali dust. Have you found the hands willing to wrap your wounds, or are you still bleeding out in the silence of their judgment? If you know what it means to rebuild from the ash, leave a trace of your fire in the comments below. Subscribe, stand with the outcasts, and walk with us into the storm. Kaelen tied off the final knot on her left wrist. He let his massive hands rest over hers for one long, lingering moment. The heat radiating from his palms seeped through the white linen, melting the remaining ice in her veins. He stood up, towering over her once more, the brief window of vulnerability snapping shut as he retreated back behind his stoic armor. He walked back to the stove, picked up his heavy hunting knife, and resumed his work on the leather. Elara looked down at her bandaged hands. They throbbed, but it was no longer the sharp, agonizing bite of decay. It was the deep, rhythmic pulse of healing. She lay back on the narrow cot, pulling the worn, thin wool blanket up to her chin. For the first time in 10 years, she closed her eyes, listened to the howling wind outside, and felt absolutely, undeniably safe. The high canyon summer was a brutal, unforgiving forge. The sun beat down on the trapped valley with the relentless, blinding intensity of a blacksmith's hammer striking an iron anvil. The air grew incredibly thin, vibrating with a dry, shimmering heat that turned the distant granite peaks into wavering, liquid mirages. Yet, despite the crushing weight of the season, the half-acre plot behind the log cabin was no longer a graveyard of pale alkali dust and brittle sagebrush. It had transformed into a dense, living ocean of amber. The winter wheat stood waist-high, the heavy, golden heads bowing slightly under the weight of their own prosperity. When the hot canyon wind swept down through the timberline, the stalks swayed and hissed in perfect unison, a rhythmic, whispering sound that Elara had come to anchor her entire existence upon. She stood at the edge of the field, the sun baking the shoulders of her worn, thin canvas shirt. Her hands, resting lightly on the top rail of the rough cedar fence, were fully healed. But they would never be the same. The raw, weeping blisters had calcified into thick, permanent ridges of hard callus. The scars wrapped around her palms like pale, jagged road maps of her survival. She did not hide them anymore. She ran her thumb over the rough skin, feeling the undeniable, absolute proof that she was no longer the fragile, hollowed-out ghost who had stood on the auction block. She had bled into the soil, and the earth had honored the contract. Harvest was only a week away. The silence of the valley was broken violently. It started as a low, unnatural vibration in the packed dirt, a rhythmic thrumming that felt entirely out of place in the isolation of the mountains. Elara stiffened, her hand instinctively dropping from the fence rail to rest on the heavy iron skinning knife she now wore at her hip. The whispering of the wheat seemed to falter. A massive flock of black crows, which had been roosting in the ancient, lightning-scarred ponderosa pines, suddenly took to the air with a deafening chorus of panicked caws, their dark wings violently tearing the quiet sky apart. From the narrow, treacherous trail that led down to Oakhaven, a thick, suffocating cloud of yellow dust began to rise. Elara did not breathe. The air in her lungs instantly turned to cold lead. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses lathered in heavy white sweat, their hooves grinding the loose shale into powder. They rode with the arrogant, loose-hipped swagger of men who believed the violence they carried was a righteous substitute for genuine courage. At the center rode Deputy Miller, a man with small, cruel eyes and a jaw perpetually stained black with chewing tobacco. The two men flanking him were hired guns, hard-scrabble drifters bought with Mayor Vance's silver, wearing rusted spurs and tied-down holsters. The past had not forgotten her. The town of Oakhaven had merely been waiting for the crop to ripen. Before the riders could even reach the halfway point of the clearing, the heavy oak door of the cabin swung open. Kaelen stepped out onto the porch. He moved with that terrifying, just coiled economy, completely silent and absolutely deadly. He did not rush to the yard. He simply stood on the raised wooden planks, his massive shoulders blocking the doorway. In his right hand, resting casually against his thigh, he held his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle. His thumb rested lightly on the massive iron hammer. The rhythm of his breathing did not change. The pale, jagged scar on his face caught the harsh midday sun as he watched the riders approach. The deputies pulled back on their reins, their horses dancing nervously, kicking up fresh clouds of alkali dust just yards from the porch. The sheer, gravitational pressure of Kaelen's presence seemed to spook the animals far more than the long ride up the mountain. Miller spat a thick stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt. He wiped his mouth with the back of a filthy leather glove. He looked at the giant on the porch. Then his small, predatory eyes slid over to Elara standing by the fence. A nasty, knowing smile stretched his lips. "Reckon you thought you were safe up here. Half-breed," Miller called out, his voice a harsh, grating sneer that shattered the sanctity of the valley. "Thought you could just buy the town's property and play house in the dirt." Kaelen did not say a word. He did not shift his weight. The Sharps rifle remained pointed at the floorboards, but the knuckles of his massive hand were stark white against the dark walnut stock. His silence was a physical wall, forcing Miller to do all the talking, forcing the deputy to hear the pathetic, hollow echo of his own bravado. Elara watched the exchange from the fence line. The sudden appearance of the badge, the sneering tone, the suffocating smell of unwashed horses and cheap tobacco, it all rushed over her like a tidal wave of ice water. For a fraction of a second, the phantom weight of the rusted iron shackles clamped down violently on her wrists. Her vision tunneled. The iron weight pressed desperately against her ribs, screaming at her to lower her eyes, to make herself small, to apologize for breathing. That was what the girl on the auction block would have done, but she looked at the golden wheat swaying behind her. She felt the thick, hard calluses on her own palms. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but it was no longer in control. It crashed against the unyielding stone of her new resolve and shattered. Miller pulled a crisp, folded piece of thick parchment from his saddlebag. It looked exactly like the ledger Mayor Vance had unrolled on the day of her ruin. The paper snapped loudly in the wind. "Mayor Vance been doing some reviewing of the municipal boundaries," Miller declared, his tone adopting a fake, bureaucratic authority. "Seems this valley ain't wild territory after all. Town charter from 1860 explicitly claims all land touching the Oakhaven watershed. That stream you've been drinking from, town property, which makes this cabin, and that pretty little field of wheat, town trust land. I bought the deed from the bank 10 years ago." Kaelen's voice finally broke the quiet. It was a low, gravel rumble, devoid of anger, but heavy with the promise of violence. "Paid in raw gold. Bank burned down 5 years back. Kaelen. Records went up in smoke." Miller sneered, waving the parchment. "This here is a newly ratified surveyor's map, signed by the mayor himself. You're squatting." The town is willing to let you stay, providing you pay the retroactive land tax, $500, or, seeing as you're likely broke, the town will graciously accept the total yield of that wheat field as collateral. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the theft hung in the hot air. They hadn't just come to take the land. They had waited until Elara had broken her back, bled into the soil, and forced it to yield life, just so they could steal the harvest. It was Vance's ultimate revenge. He couldn't own her labor through the auction, so he was stealing the product of it under the guise of the law. "You ain't getting a single grain," Elara said. Her voice cut through the canyon wind, shocking even the hired drifters. She stepped away from the fence, walking slowly into the open yard. Her hands were no longer trembling. The stutter that had plagued her youth, the hesitation born of abuse, was completely gone. Miller laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You talking back now, girl? Thought Vance beat that out of you. You don't have a say in town business." Elara stopped 10 feet from Miller's horse. She looked up at the deputy, her eyes the color of scorched earth, burning with an absolute, terrifying clarity. "I ain't a girl, and I ain't your property," Elara declared, her voice ringing like a blacksmith's hammer on cold steel. "That wheat didn't grow because of a piece of paper. It grew because I poured wood ash and my own blood into the alkali. You go back and tell Mayor Vance that if he wants the harvest, he can come up here and dig it out of the dirt with his own soft, thieving hands. But he won't, because men like him only know how to reap what better folks have sown." The two hired drifters shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their hands drifting instinctively toward their holstered revolvers. The woman they had expected to find, a broken, terrified servant, was nowhere to be seen. Miller's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He pointed a leather-clad finger at her. "You watch your mouth, you worn-thin piece of trash. The law gives us the right to seize the property by force if the tax ain't paid." The loud, unmistakable clack-clack of a heavy iron hammer being pulled back to full cock severed Miller's sentence completely. Every eye turned to the porch. Kaelen had raised the heavy Sharps rifle. The massive muzzle, large enough to drop a charging bison at 500 yards, was aimed dead center at Miller's chest. Kaelen had not blinked. The deep scar on his jaw was stark white. "The tax is fraudulent," Kaelen stated, his voice a terrifying whisper. "The paper is a lie, and if any of you draw iron on this property, the town of Oakhaven is going to need a new deputy, and 2 new drifters." The silence that followed was suffocating. The canyon wind seemed to hold its breath. The drifters froze, their hands hovering inches from their guns, calculating the odds. They were hired to intimidate a half-breed and a broken woman, not to get cut in half by a buffalo rifle. Miller swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He slowly raised his hands, pulling on the reins to back his nervous horse away. "You got until the end of the week." Miller spat, his voice trembling slightly beneath the bravado. 7 days. You don't bring the gold or the grain down to the town square by noon on Sunday. The mayor is sending the whole militia. We'll burn this cabin to the foundation and take the wheat from your dead hands. Let's ride." He violently spurred his horse, hauling the beast around. The 2 drifters followed immediately, clearly eager to escape the shadow of the massive Sharps rifle. They galloped back toward the treacherous trail, kicking up a fresh storm of choking yellow dust. Elara stood in the yard, watching the dust cloud slowly settle back into the baked earth. The threat had retreated, but the damage was done. The outside world had violently breached their sanctuary. She turned slowly to look at Kaelen. He slowly lowered the heavy rifle. He uncocked the hammer with a quiet click. He looked out at the golden field of wheat, then back toward the dark, ominous peaks of the surrounding mountains. The silence returned to the valley, but it was no longer a peaceful isolation. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet before a massive, devastating storm. The past had returned, and it had brought an army with it. The departure of the deputies did not return the valley to its previous rhythm. It shattered it entirely. The air remained incredibly heavy, charged with a suffocating metallic tension that tasted like the prelude to a dry lightning strike. Over the next 48 hours, the punishing canyon heat, rather than breaking, intensified into a brutal, unrelenting fever. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow, thick with a fine, chalky dust that drifted down from the high peaks. The stream at the edge of the timberline, the very lifeblood that Elara had hauled bucket by agonizing bucket to cure the soil, began to run dangerously shallow. The smooth, water-worn stones of the riverbed lay exposed, bleaching bone-white in the sun. If the water dried up completely before the wheat was fully hardened, the crop would wither into useless, brittle straw within days. Kaelen spent the entirety of the second day pacing the length of the receding stream, his heavy boots crushing the dry mud. The silent, stoic mountain of a man was visibly agitated. His movements lacked their usual terrifying economy. They were restless, driven by a deep, primal urgency. Late in the afternoon, he returned to the cabin, his duster coated in pale dust. "The snowmelt is gone," Kaelen announced, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He dropped his heavy leather saddlebags onto the rough-hewn table. The high reservoir behind the granite ridge must have cracked and drained into the limestone caves. The stream will be completely dead by tomorrow. Elara looked up from the iron stove, where she was carefully wiping down a cast-iron skillet. The suffocating weight pressed instantly against her ribs. The deputies were threatening to burn them out in 5 days, and now the land itself was threatening to starve them first. What do we do? We can't haul water from the lower valley. The deputies will be watching the trail. There's an old artesian spring, Kaelen said, his dark eyes fixed on the map of deep scars on the table's surface. 3 days. Ride deep into the Blackwood Gorge. It never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. If I can pack enough canvas bladders and load the draft horses, I can bring back enough water to soak the roots one last time. It'll hold the wheat until the harvest. He looked at her. The silence twixt them was heavy with the unspoken risk. He would be leaving her alone, completely isolated, with the threat of Vance's militia hanging over the valley. Elara set the heavy skillet down on the stove. The metal clanged sharply. She did not hesitate. The stutter was dead and buried. How long? 2 days to get there and load the water. 2 days back? Kaelen replied, his voice devoid of false comfort. 4 days. I'll be back the night before Vance's deadline. Go, Elara said firmly, her voice a steeled declaration. She walked to the corner, picked up the massive Sharp's buffalo rifle sight and held it out to him. You'll need this in the gorge. There are mountain lions. Kaelen looked at the heavy iron barrel, then at her steady, scarred hands. He shook his head slowly. He reached behind his back, pulled his heavy, bone-handled Colt revolver from his belt, and laid it gently on the wooden table. Keep the rifle, he said softly, his dark eyes holding hers with an absolute, terrifying intensity. A lion is just a hungry animal. Men are much worse. If anyone rides up that trail before I get back, you don't talk to them. You don't warn them. You aim for the center of the chest and you pull the trigger. The gravity of the instruction hung in the stifling air. You aim for the center of the chest. Elara stared at the heavy Colt on the table. The man who had bought her life, the man who had meticulously cleaned the alkali dust from her bleeding hands, was now authorizing her to take a life to protect what they had built. He trusted her not just to survive, but to be lethal. The realization did not bring fear. It brought a cold, absolute clarity. The victim was dead. She was the guardian of the harvest now. Kaelen packed the draft horses in the fading, sickly twilight. He did not say a long goodbye. He merely checked the cinch on the saddle, gave Elara one last, long look that communicated 1,000 unspoken words, and led the massive roan horses into the dense timberline. The silence of his absence immediately rushed into the valley, far heavier and more suffocating than before. The calamity struck on the evening of the third day. Elara had spent the excruciating, lonely days meticulously oiling the rifle, checking the perimeter of the cedar fence, and watching the bruised yellow sky. The wind had died completely. The stillness was unnatural, heavy, and deeply wrong. It began as a dark, shifting stain on the distant horizon, rolling over the jagged peaks like a bruised storm cloud, but there was no thunder. Instead, there was a sound, a low, rhythmic, mechanical whirring that vibrated against her teeth. It sounded like 1,000,000 dry leaves scraping against rusted iron. Elara stepped onto the porch, her hand instinctively gripping the doorframe. The heat was unbearable. The dark cloud crested the canyon wall and began to descend into the valley. As it drew closer, the cloud fractured into millions of distinct, frantic shapes. Locusts. It was a plague, born of the extreme heat and drought, driven over the mountains by the lack of food. The sky above the cabin instantly went black, blotting out the setting sun. The sound became a deafening, terrifying roar. They hit the roof of the cabin like a violent hailstorm, their hard, chitinous bodies rattling against the thick logs. Elara's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp gasp of pure terror. The wheat, the half-acre of amber gold, the crop that held her freedom, Kaelen's land, and their very lives, was sitting exposed in the open field. She grabbed the heavy canvas sacks from the porch, threw them over her shoulders, and sprinted blindly toward the field. The air was thick with the insects. They battered against her face, tangling in her hair, their spiky legs scratching at her bare arms. The smell of them was foul, an overwhelming stench of dry decay and ravenous hunger. She reached the fence line. The swarm was already descending upon the stalks. The terrifying sound of millions of jaws snapping and tearing at the green and gold husks filled the air. They were devouring the harvest with horrifying speed. "No!" Elara screamed, her voice tearing out of her raw throat, completely lost in the deafening roar of the swarm. "No, you don't!" She began swinging the heavy canvas sacks wildly, violently beating the locusts off the stalks. She thrashed her arms, crushing dozens of them with every frantic swing, their bodies popping with a sickening crunch beneath the canvas. But it was entirely useless. For every 100 she killed, 1,000 more landed, immediately stripping the leaves and chewing into the soft, unripened grain. She swung until her shoulders screamed in agony. The bitter tears mixed with the sweat and dust on her face. This couldn't be the end. She had survived the auction. She had bled into the alkali dust. She had broken the dead earth. She would not let a mindless plague steal her resurrection. The desperation fueled a sudden, chaotic energy in her blood. She needed smoke. She needed a massive, suffocating fire. She dropped the sacks and sprinted toward the shed. She grabbed the rusted iron pitchfork and ran to the large pile of dry, brittle sagebrush Kaelen had cleared weeks ago. She hauled massive, scratchy bundles of the brush into the center of the field, completely ignoring the painful scratches on her arms and the locusts crawling over her neck. She ran to the smokehouse, scooped a shovel full of hot, glowing embers from the fire pit, and sprinted back. She dumped the red coals directly into the center of the dry sagebrush pile. The brittle wood caught instantly, a massive plume of thick, acrid, white smoke billowed violently into the dark sky. Elara grabbed a heavy wooden bucket of water, a desperate remnant from her meager supply, and sloshed it over the edges of the fire, turning the bright flames into a dense, suffocating smudge. She grabbed the pitchfork and began violently spreading the smoking, smoldering brush throughout the rows of wheat. The thick smoke rolled low over the ground, choking the air. The locusts, blinded and suffocated by the heavy ash, began to drop from the stalks in massive, writhing clumps. The deafening, mechanical roar shifted into a chaotic, panicked buzzing as the swarm desperately tried to flee the smoke. Elara ran relentlessly back and forth, feeding the smudge fires with every piece of damp wood and green scrub oak she could find, completely disregarding the intense heat blistering her skin and the thick smoke searing her lungs. She fought the plague for 4 excruciating, blinding hours, moving like a demon in the dark, her face entirely blackened by soot, her lungs burning with every agonizing breath. When the bruised dawn finally broke, the swarm had moved on, driven away by the massive wall of smoke. Elara collapsed onto her knees in the dirt, the pitchfork slipping from her ruined hands. The field was scarred, the outer rows were entirely stripped, reduced to barren, broken stalks. But the center of the field, the vast majority of the crop, was safe. It stood tall, smelling heavily of wood smoke, but it was whole. She fell forward, pressing her soot-stained forehead against the cool, dark earth, gasping for the clean morning air. She had saved the harvest, but as she lay there, the ground beneath her cheek began to vibrate. It wasn't the erratic thrum of locusts. It was the heavy, synchronized thud of galloping horses. The 4 days were not up. Kaelen was not due back. Elara slowly pushed herself off the ground, her muscles trembling with absolute exhaustion. She looked toward the treacherous trail. 6 riders were emerging from the timberline. They were not carrying tax ledgers. They were carrying torches. Mayor Vance had grown impatient. The real calamity had just arrived. The 6 riders fanned out as they entered the clearing, their horses snorting heavily, eyes wide and spooked by the lingering, acrid smell of the smudge fires. They wore dark bandanas pulled tight over their noses and mouths, hiding their faces. But Elara recognized the heavy, rusted spurs and the swaggering, arrogant posture of the hired guns from the town. They hadn't come under the thin guise of the law this time. They had come as arsonists in the broad, suffocating light of day. Mayor Vance, impatient and cowardly, had decided to burn the evidence of his theft before Kaelen could return with the water. Elara stood alone in the center of the yard, completely exposed. Her gingham dress was scorched and completely black with soot. Her face was streaked with ash and dried sweat. Her hair wild and tangled with dead locusts. She was utterly exhausted, her muscles screaming with a dull, constant fire from fighting the plague all night. The instinct to run, the old, deep-seated reflex to hide from violence, flared briefly in her chest, a cold spike of adrenaline. "Run," the ghost of the girl on the auction block whispered. "Hide in the timberline. Let them burn it. You can't fight 6 men." But she looked at the heavy, amber heads of the wheat she had just bled to save. She looked at the cabin where Kaelen had gently washed her broken hands. She had stopped running the day she picked up the heavy iron mattock. She was no longer a victim waiting for the gavel to fall. She was the guardian of this land. The cold spike of fear in her chest didn't paralyze her. It crystallized into pure, unyielding ice. She turned and sprinted toward the cabin, her boots kicking up the alkali dust. "Hey, get back here, you dirty half-breed whore!" one of the riders shouted, his voice muffled by the bandana. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a heavy revolver from his hip. Elara slammed the heavy oak door shut, just as a bullet splintered the wood frame inches from her head, the sharp crack echoing violently in the canyon. She didn't flinch. She dove for the corner, her soot-stained hands grasping the heavy walnut stock of the massive Sharps buffalo rifle. She grabbed the leather bandolier draped over the cot, throwing it clumsily over her shoulder. The massive brass cartridges clinked together, the sound of heavy, uncompromising arithmetic. She kicked out the thick wooden block holding the heavy window shutter closed. The wood swung open with a bang. She rested the heavy octagonal iron barrel on the windowsill, dropping to one knee. Outside, the riders had stopped in the center of the yard, laughing. They were bold, assuming the cabin was occupied only by a terrified, unarmed woman. Two of the men dismounted, pulling long, thick torches from their saddlebags. Another man struck a lucifer match against the saddle horn and touched it to the pitch-soaked rags. The torches flared violently, thick black smoke rolling off the flames. "Burn the field first," the leader yelled, pointing toward the amber wheat. "Let her watch it go up, then we torch the cabin." Elara pulled the heavy iron hammer back to full cock. The loud, double clack, clack sounded like a death knell in the small room. She settled the heavy stock securely against her bruised shoulder. She remembered Kaelen's voice, low and devoid of pity. "You aim for the center of the chest and you pull the trigger." She did not aim for the chest, she aimed for the torch. She squeezed the heavy trigger. The massive Sharps rifle roared, a deafening, concussive explosion that violently shook the dust from the cabin ceiling. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a mule kick, snapping her teeth together. Outside, the massive .50 caliber lead slug tore across the yard. It didn't hit the man's chest. It slammed directly into the wooden handle of the blazing torch in his hand. The impact violently shattered the wood into 1,000 splinters. The blazing, pitch-soaked rags exploded into a shower of sparks, flying directly into the face of the rider's horse. The horse screamed, rearing up violently on its hind legs. The rider, completely stunned by the sheer concussive force of the shot, was thrown backward into the dirt, landing hard on his spine. The laughter in the yard ceased instantly. The remaining riders jerked their horses back, their revolvers snapping up, firing blindly toward the cabin. Bullets thudded heavily into the thick log walls, sending violent showers of wood splinters raining down on Elara's head. Elara didn't panic. The silence in her mind was absolute, cold, and calculated. She pulled the heavy lever down, the breech opening with a metallic clatter. The smoking, spent brass cartridge ejected onto the floorboards. She reached into the bandolier, pulled a fresh, heavy cartridge, shoved it into the chamber, and snapped the lever back up. Breathe, cock, aim. She shifted her aim to the second man holding a torch, who was frantically trying to control his panicked horse near the edge of the wheat field. She fired again. The thunderous roar echoed off the canyon walls. The massive bullet struck the dirt mere inches from the horse's front hooves, blowing a crater the size of a dinner plate into the baked earth. The beast bucked violently, throwing the second torch into the dirt, where it immediately sputtered and died in the dry dust. "Jesus Christ!" one of the riders screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "That ain't no pistol. She's got a buffalo gun." "Rush the door!" the leader yelled, his voice desperate. "She can't reload that cannon fast enough. Go!" 3 riders violently spurred their horses, charging directly at the cabin door, their revolvers blazing. Elara dropped the heavy Sharps rifle onto the cot. It was too slow for close quarters. She snatched the heavy, bone-handled Colt revolver Kaelen had left on the table. She didn't hide behind the log wall. She kicked the heavy oak door open with her boot, stepping straight out onto the raised wooden porch, entirely exposing herself to the charging men. She stood tall, the soot and ash coating her face like war paint. She was the salt of the earth, unyielding and unbreakable. The suffocating weight of the town's judgment was gone, replaced entirely by the fierce, protective fury of a mother defending her child. The wheat was hers, the land was hers, and they would bleed before they took it. She raised the heavy Colt, holding it securely with both hands. She didn't close her eyes. She stared dead into the terrified eyes of the lead rider. She cocked the hammer and fired. The sharp crack of the pistol cut through the roar of the horses. The bullet caught the lead rider high in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his revolver, his body twisting violently in the saddle as the horse veered sharply away from the porch. She thumbed the hammer back instantly, swinging the barrel toward the second rider. The man saw the cold, terrifying resolve in her eyes. He saw a woman who had completely accepted the inevitability of death, making her absolutely fearless. He violently yanked hard on the reins, his horse skidding sideways in the alkali dust, nearly throwing him before he spurred it back toward the trail in a frantic, desperate retreat. The third rider, the leader, hauled his horse to a sliding stop mere yards from the porch. His gun was raised, pointed directly at Elara's chest. Elara did not blink. She stood perfectly still, the heavy Colt aimed dead center at his face. The silence stretched, a tight, agonizing wire suspended twixt them. "Shoot me," Elara whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying, steeled calm that was infinitely louder than a scream. "Shoot me, and I'll put this bullet straight through your teeth before I hit the ground. You want this land? Come earn it." The leader stared at her. His hand trembled slightly. He was a bully, accustomed to terrifying the weak, not facing down a demon forged in ash and alkali. The woman on the porch was not fighting for money, she was fighting for her soul. He looked at his bleeding companion riding desperately for the timberline, then back to the unwavering black eye of the Colt. He slowly lowered his revolver. He backed his horse away, step by agonizing step, his eyes never leaving hers. "Vance is going to send the whole damn militia, you crazy bitch," he spat, his voice thick with humiliation and fear. "Here, tell Vance to bring shovels," Elara replied, her voice flat and cold. "He's going to need them to bury you all." The leader hauled his horse around and spurred it savagely, galloping after his fleeing men, disappearing into the thick cloud of yellow dust on the trail. Elara stood on the porch, the heavy Colt still raised, her chest heaving violently. She waited until the dust settled completely, until the absolute, crushing silence of the valley returned. Only then did she slowly lower the gun. Her legs buckled instantly, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. She collapsed onto the hard wooden planks of the porch, the gun clattering from her numb fingers. She looked out at the half-acre of amber wheat, still standing tall, smelling of smoke and victory. She touched her face, her fingers coming away, stained with black soot. She let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half-triumphant laugh. The town had tried to burn her, but they had only succeeded in forging her into steel. The external crisis had broken over her, and she had remained standing. She was ready for the harvest, and she was ready for the mayor. The heavy, iron-banded wheels of Kaelen's wagon ground against the hard-packed dirt of Oakhaven's main street, the sound sharp and unforgiving. It was high noon on Sunday. The bruised, yellow sky of the drought had finally broken, leaving behind a stark, blindingly bright blue expanse that offered absolutely nowhere for shadows to hide. The street was completely silent, but it wasn't empty. The townspeople had gathered, lining the wooden boardwalks in a dense, suffocating mass. They watched the approaching wagon with wide, apprehensive eyes, expecting a surrendered, broken woman delivering a meager tribute of grain to beg for her life. What they saw instead drove a heavy, collective spike of shock straight through their chests. Kaelen drove the massive roan draft horses, sitting tall on the buckboard, his scarred face impassive and utterly terrifying in the bright light. But the true shock was the woman sitting beside him. Elara was not wearing the threadbare, stained gingham dress they remembered. She wore a tailored riding skirt of heavy, dark canvas and a clean, white linen shirt. The soot and ash had been meticulously scrubbed away, but the deep, sun-baked tan of endless labor remained. Her posture was perfectly rigid, her shoulders square, completely lacking the submissive hunch that had once defined her. A heavy, bone-handled Colt revolver rested comfortably in a leather holster strapped to her hip. But the most striking change was her eyes. They were no longer hollowed-out pits of dead earth. They were burning, sharp, and absolutely fearless. Behind them, the bed of the wagon was piled dangerously high with heavy canvas sacks, each one bulging tight. The rich, earthy smell of cured winter wheat, a scent of prosperity completely alien to the dying, drought-stricken town, rolled off the wagon in thick waves. Kaelen pulled back hard on the reins directly in front of the town square, halting the wagon exactly where the wooden auction block had stood months ago. He set the heavy iron brake with a loud, grinding screech. He stepped down effortlessly and moved to the back of the wagon. Mayor Vance stepped out onto the raised wooden porch of the bank. He was flanked by Deputy Miller and the heavily bandaged leader of the hired drifters. Vance's tailored wool suit hung loosely on his frame. The drought had thinned even his oily prosperity. He looked at the massive pile of wheat in the wagon, a greedy, predatory gleam instantly overriding the brief flash of confusion on his face. "Well," Vance called out, his voice attempting its old, theatrical resonance but sounding thin and desperate in the dry air. "I see you've decided to adhere to the law after all. I must admit, I am pleasantly surprised. Bring the grain to the bank's storehouse. The town accepts your retroactive tax payment." Kaelen did not move. He stood near the tailgate, his massive arms crossed over his broad chest. He looked at Elara, offering her the silent, heavy space to fight her own war. Elara stood up on the buckboard. She looked out over the sea of faces, the same faces that had laughed, whispered, and spat tobacco juice into the dirt while pricing her soul at $20. The silence in her mind didn't hang. It coiled tight, a steeled spring ready to snap. "We ain't here to pay a tax. Vance?" Elara's voice rang out, carrying across the square with a stunning, jagged clarity that made several people physically flinch. "We're here to settle an account." Vance's oily smile faltered. His hand tightened around the silver-tipped walking stick. "Watch your tone, girl." You are speaking to the legal authority of this township. The tax is absolute. The tax is a lie, Elara shot back, her voice raising a fraction, cutting twixt the wooden buildings. She stepped down from the wagon, walking slowly and deliberately to the back. Kaelen reached into the wagon bed and hauled one of the heavy canvas sacks out, letting it drop to the dirt at Elara's feet with a heavy thud. Elara drew the heavy hunting knife from her belt in a fluid, practiced motion. She slashed the blade violently across the belly of the canvas sack. A torrent of pure golden winter wheat spilled onto the dry, baked earth. The grains caught the harsh sunlight, gleaming like thousands of tiny, solid gold nuggets. A collective gasp rippled through the starving, desperate crowd. It was the highest quality grain Oak Haven had ever seen, fat and perfect, untouched by the locusts or the drought. "Look at it," Elara commanded, her voice dropping to a fierce, compelling rumble that demanded total silence. She pointed the tip of her knife at the pile of gold. "Look at what dead earth can yield when it ain't choked by the likes of you." She walked past the pile, moving steadily toward the bank's porch, her boots crunching loudly in the dirt. The heavy iron weight in her chest, the suffocating presence that had crushed her for 10 years, was completely gone. She wasn't just speaking to Vance, she was speaking to the terrified ghost of the girl on the auction block. Every step she took toward the mayor was a violent exorcism. She felt the thick, hard calluses on her palms rubbing against the leather handle of her knife. She remembered the blinding pain of the mattock, the burning lie, the suffocating smoke of the smudge fires. She had earned this moment with blood. 10 years ago, Elara began, stopping at the base of the wooden steps, her eyes locked dead onto Vance's pale face. "You stood on a box in this very square and told this town that my father's failure was a debt I had to carry. You convinced them that my life was worth less than a broken plowshare. You sold me to the highest bidder to maintain your order. It was the law," Vance stammered, taking a step back, visibly unnerved by the absolute, cold fury radiating from her. Deputy Miller shifted nervously, his hand dropping toward his gun, but a sharp, warning clack of Kaelen, cocking the massive Sharps rifle, instantly froze him in place. "It was a ledger," Elara corrected, her voice echoing violently. "A piece of paper you used to bury me so you wouldn't have to look at your own rot. And when this man—" She pointed back at Kaelen without looking away from Vance. "When he paid you $400 in raw gold to clear that ledger, you couldn't stand it. Because if I wasn't property, if I wasn't a servant, then you were just a thief in a tailored suit." The crowd was completely breathless. No one had ever spoken to the mayor like this. No one had ever dared to challenge the absolute authority of the bank. "So you drafted a new map," Elara continued, her voice rising, filled with a jagged, righteous anger that commanded the entire square. "You sent armed drifters to burn the cabin we built. You sent men to steal the harvest I bled into the alkali dust to grow. Because you don't know how to build anything. Vance, you only know how to feed on the broken pieces of better folks." "Arrest her!" Vance shrieked, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at Elara. "Miller, arrest her for sedition and armed threat." Miller didn't move. He looked at Elara, standing fearlessly at the base of the steps, her hand resting near the heavy colt, and then he looked at the massive pile of golden wheat bleeding into the dirt. He looked at the starving faces of the townspeople staring at the grain. "I said arrest her!" Vance screamed, the veneer of civilization completely stripped away, revealing the panicked, pathetic coward beneath. "With what army?" Elara asked, her voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper that somehow carried further than Vance's scream. She stepped onto the first wooden step, The men you sent yesterday ran like whipped dogs, and the people standing behind me. She slowly turned her head, sweeping her gaze over the silent crowd. They ain't looking at your ledgers anymore, Vance. They're looking at the wheat. She turned back to the mayor, taking the final steps onto the porch, invading his space entirely. Vance shrank back against the door frame of the bank, his walking stick clattering to the floorboards. Elara reached into the pocket of her canvas skirt. She pulled out a heavy purse, dark iron key, the same key Kaelen had used to unlock her shackles. She threw it violently at Vance's feet. It hit the wood with a sharp clang. "I don't owe you anything," Elara declared, her voice a steeled, absolute truth. "I don't owe this town anything. The debt is dead. I buried it under a half-acre of ash and lye. And if you ever send another rider up that mountain, I won't shoot the torches. I will come down here, and I will burn this bank to the ground with you inside it." She stared at him for one long, agonizing second, making sure he understood the absolute certainty of her promise. Vance couldn't hold her gaze. He looked down at the iron key, a broken, ruined man entirely stripped of his power. Elara turned her back on him. She walked down the steps and back to the wagon. The crowd parted for her, not out of pity, but out of profound, undeniable respect. She reached the back of the wagon. Kaelen looked down at her, the deep scar on his face pulling tight in the faintest, rarest shadow of a proud smile. He offered his massive, calloused hand. Elara didn't hesitate. She took it. The warmth of his grip was the only anchor she needed in the world. She pulled herself up onto the buckboard, sitting tall beside the giant. "Leave the torn sack," Kaelen rumbled quietly, releasing the heavy iron brake. "Let them choke on the gold." He snapped the reins. The massive draft horses lunged forward, the wagon groaning as it rolled through the square. Elara did not look back at the town. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, jagged horizon, where the high canyon and the amber fields waited. They left Oak Haven in silence, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat. It was the ringing, absolute silence of total victory. 7 years later, the High Canyon summer was no longer a brutal forge. It was a warm, golden embrace. The bruised, yellow sky of the drought had long since faded from memory, replaced by a deep, impossible blue that stretched endlessly over the jagged granite peaks. The single, half-acre plot of winter wheat behind the old log cabin had expanded, marching relentlessly down the valley floor, transforming the barren, alkali-choked land into a vast, rolling ocean of amber. When the wind swept down through the timberline, the sound was no longer a dry hiss, but a deep, resonant sigh of absolute prosperity. The earth had not just yielded, it had surrendered completely to the scarred hands that tended it. The harsh, purely functional cabin of unpeeled logs was gone, replaced by a sprawling, sturdy ranch house built from thick, cured cedar and riverstone. It sat securely against the canyon wall, a testament to endurance rather than mere survival. A large, wrap-around porch offered shade against the midday sun. The thick wooden planks, polished smooth by years of heavy boots and running feet. Elara stood at the edge of the porch, leaning comfortably against a sturdy cedar post. She was 35, but the years of back-breaking labor had not aged her. They had refined her. The deep, sun-baked tan was permanent, the lines around her eyes carved by squinting into the sun rather than by weeping in the dark. The thick, hard calluses on her palms were still there, the jagged scars of her past permanently etched into her skin, but she wore them with the quiet, unyielding pride of a seasoned general wearing battle ribbons. She wore a simple, well-made dress of soft blue cotton, a stark contrast to the threadbare gingham she had once been forced to wear. She held a heavy, steaming ceramic mug of coffee, watching the activity in the valley below. The ranch was thriving. It was a completely self-sustaining world, entirely removed from the corrupt ledgers of Oakhaven. Down by the rushing, snow-fed stream, a massive water wheel turned slowly, a rhythmic clack splash that powered a small, private grist mill Kaelen had built the previous spring. The heavy scent of fresh milled flour and cured leather hung pleasantly in the morning air. Elara took a slow sip of the hot coffee. The taste of it, rich and strong, brought a profound grounding warmth to her chest. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the sheer weight of her current reality settle over her. She remembered the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating pressure of the rusted iron shackles. She remembered the sheer terror of the locust swarm and the blinding heat of the smudge fires. Those memories no longer pressed against her ribs. They simply formed the bedrock foundation upon which this golden life was built. The silence in her mind was no longer a steeled spring ready to snap. It was a vast, peaceful lake, reflecting the endless blue sky above. A sudden, sharp burst of laughter broke her reverie. A small boy, no more than 5 years old, came tearing around the side of the house. He was a miniature force of nature, his dark hair wild, his face smeared heavily with black mud and blackberry juice. He wore miniature canvas overalls and carried a fiercely carved wooden stick like a broadsword. "I caught the bear! Mama, I caught the bear!" the boy yelled, his voice a bright, ringing bell in the quiet valley. Elara smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to her scarred, earth-colored eyes. "Is that right, Elias? You must be a mighty hunter to catch a bear before breakfast." "I am," Elias declared proudly, stopping at the base of the porch steps to furiously brandish his wooden sword. "He was huge, bigger than Papa, but I chased him all the way to the stream." Behind the boy, the massive, towering figure of Kaelen stepped into view. He carried a heavy, iron-banded bucket of fresh milk effortlessly in one hand. The years had only added to the sheer, gravitational pressure of his presence, turning the scarred mountain of a man into an immovable, foundational pillar of the valley. His dark hair was threaded heavily with silver at the temples, but the coiled, dangerous energy was still there, softened only slightly by the presence of his son. He walked up the steps, setting the heavy bucket down on the porch with a soft thud. He looked at Elias, then up at Elara. The pale, jagged scar on his jaw pulled tight as a rare, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. The bear was indeed massive. Kaelen rumbled, his voice a low, comforting gravel. "And incredibly fast. I barely escaped with the milk." Elias beamed, puffing out his small chest before turning and sprinting toward the barn, yelling a battle cry at a flock of startled chickens. Kaelen stepped closer to Elara. The silence twixt them was no longer heavy or isolating. It was the comfortable, deeply worn groove of two people who had forged their souls in the same fire. He reached out with his massive, calloused hand, gently resting it on the small of her back. The heat radiating from his palms seeped through the soft cotton of her dress, a steady, unbreakable anchor. "The north field is ready for the scythe," Kaelen said quietly, looking out over the rolling ocean of amber wheat. It's a heavy yield this year, heavier than the last. We'll need to hire more hands from the lower valley to help with the threshing," Elara noted, her mind shifting seamlessly to the logistics of the harvest. "I sent word yesterday," Kaelen replied. "They'll be here by morning." They asked if we wanted to sell the surplus to the bank in Oakhaven. Elara's gaze hardened slightly. A brief flash of the steeled guardian. Mayor Vance had died of a weak heart 3 years ago, his empire of ledgers crumbling shortly after his public humiliation. The town had survived, but it was a different place now. Far more cautious, far more respectful of the boundaries set by the half-breed and his wife in the High Canyon. "No," Elara said flatly. "We don't sell to Oakhaven. We'll load the wagons and take the surplus over the pass to the railhead in Denver. We deal in fair weight and honest coin. Let the ghost of Vance's bank starve on its own." Kaelen nodded once, accepting the decree without question. He turned his gaze back to her face, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her scars. He lifted his hand from her back and gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch remained shockingly delicate, a stark contrast to the rough violence etched into his skin. "You built an empire out of ash, Elara," he murmured, his voice dropping to a somber, hollowed whisper intended only for her. Elara looked up into the eyes of the man who had bought her debt with gold and handed her the mattock. She reached up, placing her scarred hand over his massive knuckles. "We built it," Elara corrected him softly. "I just broke the dirt. You were the mountain that kept the storm from washing it away." They stood together in the morning sun, two outcasts who had refused to be buried by the bitterness of the world. They had taken the dead, poisoned earth, and forced it to yield life. The rusted iron shackles of their past were gone, replaced by the unbreakable, golden bond of the harvest. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving Elara and Kaelen on the sunlit porch. The view ascends high above the sprawling ranch, sweeping over the endless, rippling ocean of golden wheat, past the grinding water wheel and over the jagged granite peaks that guard the valley. The high canyon wind whistles a low, mournful, yet profoundly peaceful tune. The world is obsessed with ledgers. It is a place constructed by men who deal in paper, in fractions, in perceived value, and in inherited sins. They will look at a patch of hardscrabble, alkali-choked earth, and call it dead. They will look at a spirit battered by failure, worn thin by the crushing weight of someone else's debt, and they will call it broken. They will tell you that your worth is exactly what they are willing to pay for your surrender. And if you listen to the silence of their judgment, if you let their whispers pack the dirt tight over your chest, you will inevitably belong to the rot. But worth is not a number written in a ledger. It is not dictated by the gavel of a corrupt mayor or the jeers of a cowardly mob. True worth is not inherited, and it certainly cannot be bought with a bag of raw gold. Worth is the terrible, blinding agony of the heavy iron mattock striking baked clay. It is the weeping blisters on your palms. It is the stinging, chemical fire of lye and wood ash burning into your open wounds. It is the quiet, terrifying resolve to stand before a swarm of locusts or a wall of armed men and declare, with absolute certainty, that you will not yield a single inch of the soil you have bled to cure. Elara did not find her salvation in Kaelen's gold. The giant merely bought her the space to fight. She found her salvation in the dirt. She took the poison of her past, the bitter humiliation of the auction block, and she used it as fertilizer. She proved that the most unyielding stone is not found in the mountains, but buried deep within the human spine. We all have our own Oakhaven. We all have voices telling us that we are the sum of our failures, that our soil is too toxic to ever grow anything of value. The ghosts of our past stand on the edges of our minds, holding rusted shackles and demanding payment for debts we never asked to incur. But the earth does not care about the past. The soil only listens to the sweat that falls upon it today. It only responds to the hands willing to break the crust, dig deep into the darkness, and plant the seeds of defiance. Look at your own hands. Are they clean, hiding comfortably in the pockets of your fear? Or are they scarred, caked in the ash of your own battles? Would you have stayed in the silence? Would you have accepted the $20 bid and let them chain you to the washboard of their expectations? Or are you ready to pick up the heavy iron, face the drought, and force your dead earth to yield? If you refuse to be priced by the mob, if you are currently swinging the mattock in the dark of your own valley, leave a trace of your fire in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel, stand with the outcasts, hold the line against the storm, and walk with us into the harvest.